Evangeline Vance didn't know the Lycan King could see through glamours. She didn't know the month-long gathering of noble candidates was merely a political trap designed to lure out the darkest, most treacherous ambitions of the high houses, and she definitely didn't know that the ancient curse meant to destroy the royal bloodline would be the very thing to awaken her own. All she knew was the biting, unrelenting cold of the winter castle of Valdris and the heavy silver tray cutting deeply into her calloused, stinging palms. It was day one of the royal courtship trials, a grand and terrifying event that had drawn the most vicious, power-hungry females from across the continent. The massive ballroom was a suffocating mass of heavy silks, blood-red jewels, and predatory scents competing for dominance. In the strict Lycan hierarchy of the 7th Eclipse era, where raw power dictated survival and fated mates were revered as living myths, Omegas like Evie were less than ghosts. They were the background noise, the invisible hands that poured the wine and scrubbed the frozen stone until their knuckles bled. She lowered her gaze, adopting the rigid, unassuming posture expected of her. Her scratchy grey wool uniform was a stark, humiliating contrast to the glittering gowns surrounding her. Earlier that morning, Miriam Croft, the stern but secretly compassionate head housekeeper, had practically begged the Omegas to remain unseen. "Do not speak unless spoken to," Mrs. Croft had warned, her sharp eyes lingering heavily on Evie in the dim light of the kitchens. "These high-born wolves are looking for a reason to display their dominance. Do not give them one. Lock your eyes on the floor." Evie had taken the warning to heart. She had bathed in harsh, skin-stripping lye soap 3 times before her shift, aggressively masking her natural scent until her skin felt raw and hollow. To be an Omega in Valdris was dangerous enough. To be an Omega whose blood carried the dormant, ancient magic of the lunar healers, smelling of rare, sun-warmed lavender, was a literal death sentence. She moved silently through the cavernous room, her apron pockets heavy with a small, sealed flask of midnight orchid tea, a rare, soothing herbal infusion she brewed exclusively in the dead of night to calm the pacing, restless energy of her own hidden wolf. Near the towering stone hearth, the crackling blue flames cast long, wicked shadows over the gathered nobility. Evie stood perfectly still, her breath shallow, offering a tray of crystal goblets to the women clustered by the fire. Lady Patricia Sterling, the arrogant daughter of a high-ranking duke, held court as if she already wore a crown. Patricia's scent hit Evie's nose like a physical blow, a cloying, aggressive mixture of crushed roses and sharp copper, layered with a faint, chemical undertone that smelled dangerously like aconite extract, hidden in a velvet pouch. Beside her, Lady Cynthia Thorne stood like a nervous, trembling shadow, smelling faintly of sour green apples and raw fear. "It is an absolute insult," Patricia sneered, swirling the crimson wine in her goblet so violently it nearly spilled over the crystal rim. "King Garrick hasn't even graced us with his presence. We have travelled for weeks through the blinding snow to present ourselves as lunar candidates, and he cowers in his private wing like a wounded animal." Cynthia cast a terrified, fleeting glance toward the massive oak doors at the far end of the hall. "They say he rarely leaves the inner sanctum anymore. Not since the boy's condition worsened. Dr. Mercer has been with the prince for 3 days straight, and they say the royal physician looks more like a corpse than a living man." Patricia let out a harsh, grating sound of pure, unadulterated disgust. The blind, crippled defect. It is a tragedy, of course, but a Lycan King cannot afford weakness. The pack needs a strong Luna to bear healthy, unbroken heirs, not a wet nurse for a cursed pup. Evie's fingers tightened around the sharp edges of her silver tray. The metal bit viciously into her skin, but she welcomed the grounding pain. It held the protective, vibrating growl locked tight in her throat. Her wolf, usually a quiet, heavily subdued presence, paced relentlessly beneath her skin at the sheer, careless malice in Patricia's voice. The boy they were speaking of was Nicholas Valerius, 5 years old, entirely innocent, and plagued by magical panic attacks that no physician, not even the brilliant Julian Mercer, could cure. "I heard the seizures are getting significantly worse," Cynthia whispered, leaning in closer so the other nobles wouldn't hear the treason on her tongue, that the magic twists around him like black ice. "What will you do, Patricia, if the king actually claims you? You would have to be a mother to it." Patricia offered a terrible, sharp smile that didn't reach her cold amber eyes. "Children can be sent away to the outer estates for specialized care, Cynthia. The winter here is harsh. Accidents happen. Once I have the silver crest of Valdris on my finger, Garrick will realize the pack's future requires letting go of his past mistakes." Before Cynthia could reply to the horrifying statement, the temperature in the ballroom violently plummeted. It was not a draft from the winter winds howling outside. This was a supernatural, bone-splintering cold that violently sucked the breath from the lungs of every werewolf in the room. The crackling blue flames in the massive hearth flickered erratically, turning a sickly ash-grey color before dying completely into nothing but frozen embers. Silence fell over the hundreds of noble candidates like a heavy, suffocating shroud. The grand oak doors at the far end of the ballroom did not burst open. They creaked open slowly, painfully, echoing in the dead quiet. Standing in the threshold was not the towering, imposing figure of King Garrick. It was a small, devastatingly fragile boy in overly large sleepwear. Nicholas. Evie's heart seized painfully in her chest. The little prince was trembling violently. His small hands were clenched into desperate fists at his sides, and his unseeing eyes, a milky, storm-glass grey, were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. But it was the magic surrounding him that made the noble women step back in absolute, visceral horror. Black frost, thick and sharp as jagged obsidian, erupted from the floorboards beneath Nicholas's bare feet. It crawled up his small, shivering legs, spreading outward in a rapid, jagged spiderweb of dark, suffocating ice. The curse. Evie had heard hushed, terrified whispers of it in the servants' quarters, but seeing it was an entirely different, agonizing nightmare. It was a parasitic magic, explicitly feeding on fear, suffocating the child from the inside out with a relentless, freezing grip. Nicholas let out a breathless, agonizing whimper that echoed off the stone walls. "Father!" Instead of rushing forward to aid their future prince, the candidates recoiled in mass panic. The primal instinct of the wolf was to flee from unnatural dark magic. "Stay back!" Lady Patricia shrieked, violently gathering her expensive silken skirts and stumbling awkwardly away from the rapidly spreading ice. Her face twisted in repulsion. "It's a seizure! The boy is dangerous! Guards, get it away from me!" "Don't let it touch you!" Lady Cynthia cried, practically shoving another noblewoman out of her way to hide behind a thick marble pillar. "It will spread to us!" The black frost accelerated, shooting aggressively across the marble floor, freezing the wine in the dropped goblets, turning the festive, opulent ballroom into a frozen, deadly tomb. Nicholas collapsed heavily to his knees, his small fingers frantically clutching his chest as he gasped for air that the curse was actively stealing from his tiny, burning lungs. Then, the high balcony doors above slammed open. The oppressive, suffocating aura of the Lycan King slammed into the room with the force of a physical detonation. King Garrick Valerius was a living nightmare of muscle, battle scars, and lethal, unyielding grace. His eyes, a burning, violently bright molten gold, locked instantly onto his suffocating son. He didn't bother with the curved stone stairs. He vaulted straight over the marble railing, a 20-foot drop, landing in a crouch that literally cracked the reinforced stone floor beneath his heavy boots. He surged forward with a primal, deafening roar, desperation radiating from him in violent, crushing physical waves. "Nico!" Garrick bellowed, his voice tearing at the seams. But the curse was ancient, intelligent, and exceedingly cruel. It was designed specifically to torture and isolate the Valerius bloodline. As Garrick lunged forward to grab his son, the black frost flared violently upward. It fed immediately on the king's dominant, aggressive alpha energy, using his own immense, uncontainable power to fuel its barrier. A thick wall of jagged dark ice erupted from the floor, violently repelling him. Garrick was thrown backward through the air, crashing into a solid stone pillar with enough force to shake the very foundations of the ancient stronghold. He scrambled up instantly, entirely ignoring the blood pouring from his massive hands where the razor-sharp ice had sliced him open. His golden eyes were wild, fully dilated with raw terror. He threw himself at the barrier again and again. Each time, the dark magic threw him back with explosive force, and each time Nicholas screamed in agony, the black ice creeping closer and closer to the boy's fragile throat. The most powerful Lycan in the world was completely, devastatingly helpless to save his own son. The noblewomen watched the horrific spectacle in terrified silence. Not a single one of them moved. Not a single candidate offered a shred of their own magic, their warmth, or their comfort. They looked at the boy not as a dying child in pain, but as a monstrous liability to be avoided at all costs. Evie watched Garrick slam his bleeding, ruined fists against the unbreakable ice. She looked at the 5-year-old boy, curling into a tight, violently shivering ball on the floor, dying in front of a room full of people who only wanted to steal his father's crown over his dead body. Something deep inside Evie's chest snapped. The heavy silver tray slipped from her numb grasp. It hit the floor with a deafening crash, crystal goblets shattering into 1,000 glittering, fragmented pieces. She ran. Evie abandoned the safety of the shadows. She ignored the shocked, outraged gasps of the noblewomen. She ignored the strict, unforgiving Lycan hierarchy that demanded she stay invisible and submissive. She ran straight toward the deadly epicenter of the black frost. "Stop!" Lady Patricia screamed from across the hall, her voice shrill with disbelief and fury. "You stupid lowly girl, you'll be killed!" Evie didn't stop. As she hit the outer edge of the black ice, a searing, agonizing cold bit ruthlessly through her thin leather shoes and grey wool stockings. It felt exactly like walking barefoot on jagged, rusted blades. Her skin burned with instant, brutal frostbite, the pain radiating up her legs in sharp, breathless spikes that threatened to drop her to her knees. But she didn't even flinch. She held her spine perfectly straight, because begging the magic to stop wouldn't have changed the outcome. She had to overpower it. She didn't have alpha strength. She didn't have violent, dominant energy for the curse to feed on and turn against her. She only had the quiet, fiercely protective maternal instinct of a hidden lunar bloodline. Evie dropped to her knees right beside the thrashing boy, completely ignoring the ice, slicing viciously into her own shins. She reached right through the deadly black frost, the ancient curse, finding nothing aggressive or commanding to repel in her completely submissive, open approach, and pulled Nicholas's small, freezing body directly against her chest. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice a soft, incredibly steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "I've got you, little wolf. You are safe." Nicholas thrashed wildly against her, his small, freezing hands blindly clawing at her scratchy uniform, desperate for a single breath of air. "It hurts. It's so cold, father." "I know, sweet boy. I know," Evie murmured. She wrapped her arms securely around his fragile frame, pulling him tighter, burying her face deeply in his icy hair to shield his face. Then she let go of her iron-clad control. She dropped the heavy, exhausting mental barriers she had maintained perfectly for years. She allowed her hidden lunar wolf to finally step forward. The harsh, stinging, artificial scent of lye soap vanished, instantly obliterated by a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, sun-warmed lavender and heavy summer rain. It rolled through the freezing ballroom like a physical, suffocating wave of pure heat. Evie began to hum. It was an ancient, sacred lunar lullaby, a deeply resonant melody her mother had sung to her in secret, a vibration that settled deep within the bone marrow and bypassed the frantic mind entirely. From the deep pockets of her apron, she quickly pulled out the sealed flask. Her midnight orchid tea. It was still wonderfully warm against her frostbitten palm. Ignoring the dark ice that was now rapidly encrusting her own arms and biting into her skin, Evie gently pried Nico's trembling, blue-tinged lips apart and tipped a few drops of the rare, potent tea directly onto his tongue. "Drink for me. Let the warmth in," she coaxed, rocking him slowly, rhythmically, pouring every ounce of her lunar healing magic into the physical contact. The effect was shockingly instantaneous. The specific magical properties of the Midnight Orchid combined seamlessly with the pure, unadulterated comfort of Evie's lunar aura, clashed violently with the dark curse. The black frost stopped spreading. For a terrifying, suspended second, the air vibrated with intense, volatile pressure, like a lung stretched to the absolute breaking point. Then, with a sound like a rupturing frozen lake, the black ice dissolved into harmless, rapidly evaporating grey mist. The oppressive, bone-chilling cold vanished from the room, replaced entirely by the radiating, profoundly soothing warmth of Evie's lavender scent. Nicholas took a massive, shuddering gasp of air. At that exact second, the heavy iron-wrought doors of the servants' corridor burst open. Dr. Julian Mercer, the royal physician, who had spent 3 agonizing, sleepless days battling the boy's affliction with useless alchemy, froze in the doorway. His heavy leather medical bag slipped from his exhausted, trembling grip. It hit the stone floor with a dull thud, spilling glass vials of rare tinctures. Julian stared, his mouth slightly parted, utterly paralyzed by the sheer impossibility unfolding before his exhausted eyes. He had seen the black frost consume grown warriors in minutes. He had charted its lethal, parasitic progression within the young prince, predicting that tonight would be the boy's final, agonizing breath. Yet here, kneeling amidst the shattered crystal and melted ice, was a simple maid in a grey uniform, doing what the finest medical minds in the Lycan Empire could not. The physician watched in absolute stunned reverence as the thick, corrupted black veins, trailing up Nicholas's pale throat rapidly, faded back to a healthy, flushed pink. From the deep shadows of the kitchen archway, Miriam Croft stood completely rigid. The stern head housekeeper pressed a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a sudden, overwhelming sob. Mrs. Croft had spent years watching Omegas break under the crushing weight of the frozen fortress's cruelty. She had strictly warned Evangeline to remain invisible, knowing the girl's deeply hidden lunar lineage would spell her immediate execution if discovered. But as the heavy, suffocating scent of sun-warmed lavender and summer rain washed over her, completely overwriting the metallic stench of the noble's fear, Miriam's terror for the girl gave way to a profound bone-deep relief. The little prince was breathing. For the first time in 5 years, the agonizing, cursed tension radiating from the boy was completely gone. Miriam wiped a single, hot tear from her lined cheek, silently thanking the moon goddess for the stubborn, fiercely protective Omega who had chosen love over survival. The blind, terrified panic slowly faded from Nicholas's cloudy grey eyes. His tiny hands stopped clawing desperately at Evie's collar and instead gripped tightly onto thick handfuls of her grey wool dress. He buried his face deep into the warm crook of her neck, breathing in her scent greedily, like a dying creature finally finding its only source of breathable air. "Warm," Nico mumbled, his small body going entirely, heavily limp against her in sheer exhaustion and ultimate relief. "You smell safe. You're safe now, I promise," Evie whispered back, resting her chin softly on top of his head. Her own hands were trembling violently from the massive adrenaline dump and the receding, throbbing pain of the frostbite, but she didn't loosen her protective grip for a second. She didn't look up at the crowd. She just held him, shielding him entirely from the hundreds of judgmental, horrified eyes she knew were staring at them in utter shock. 10 feet away, King Garrick Valerius had frozen completely in place. He was on his knees amid the melted, steaming puddles of frost, his profusely bleeding hands hovering uselessly in the air. He wasn't looking at his son. He was staring directly at the servant girl, kneeling on his ruined floor, cradling his entire world so fiercely in her arms. Garrick's massive chest he heaved. The air in the ballroom had completely changed. The rich, overwhelming scent of sun-warmed lavender hit him. It didn't just hit his nose. It hit his very soul. It slammed into his massive chest like a physical blow, ripping ruthlessly through the cold, dead, echoing hollow inside him that had sat terrifyingly empty for decades. The severed, dormant link in his soul snapped violently into place, like a fractured bone suddenly, violently snapping back into alignment. His lichen beast, usually a snarling, violent entity of pure rage and untamed, bloody aggression, went completely, reverently still within his mind. Mate. The word thundered through their sudden, blinding connection like a heavy war drum. Garrick had spent agonizing years searching the continent. He had invited hundreds of vicious, high-born females into his home, enduring their pathetic, transparent attempts to woo him, all for the desperate sake of finding a strong Luna to protect his disabled son. And all this time, his salvation had been right here, scrubbing his flaws, serving wine to cruel women who weren't fit to breathe the exact same air as her. He watched the incredibly gentle way the Omega held his broken boy. He remembered the shrill, disgusted shrieks of Patricia and Cynthia, the cowardly way they'd had backed away to save their own skin. And then he looked at Evie, who had thrown her fragile body into a deadly, agonizing curse without a single second of hesitation, her own slender hands bruised and severely frostbitten, just to bring a strange child a moment of comfort. Garrick slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. The entire grand ballroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute, heavy with the terrifying, suffocating weight of the Lycan King's unbroken, predatory focus. Lady Patricia, standing safely at the far edge of the melted ice, quickly tried to fix her posture, anxiously smoothing her silk skirts. She foolishly, arrogantly assumed the king was about to brutally punish the lowly servant for daring to lay her unpermitted hands on the royal heir. "Your Majesty," Patricia began, her voice dripping with false, sickeningly sweet concern. The maid forgot her place. We tried to stop her from interfering with the prince's affliction. Silence, the single, deadly word from Garrick, was spoken so quietly, yet it cracked through the heavy air like a physical whip. Patricia snapped her mouth shut instantly, all the colour draining rapidly from her face as the king's crushing, lethal killing intent flared outward, pressing the nobles to their knees. Garrick didn't even look at the trembling noblewoman. His burning, molten gold eyes were fixed solely on Evie. He took a slow, heavy step forward, then another. The sheer, terrifying heat radiating from his massive frame made the remaining puddles of melted ice hiss and evaporate instantly into steam. Evie finally, hesitantly looked up. She expected anger. She expected to be dragged violently by the royal guards and thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeons for breaking hierarchy, for revealing her illegal lunar scent, for daring to touch the prince without express permission. She angled her face downward, maintaining a rigid, formal stance, ready to accept whatever brutal punishment the Valerian monarch doled out with the quiet, unbroken dignity she had always carried. But when Garrick stopped directly in front of her, he didn't call for his armed guards. The massive, terrifying Lycan King, a ruthless warrior who had slaughtered entire rebel armies and conquered rival kingdoms without ever blinking, slowly, reverently sank down onto one knee on the damp marble floor. He was so incredibly close that Evie could physically feel the immense, radiating heat of his skin. She could clearly see the deep gold of his irises swirling with an emotion so intense, so overwhelmingly raw, that it made her breath catch painfully in her throat. He looked at her not as a lowly servant, not as an invisible Omega, but as a dying man looking at his absolute salvation. He reached out with one massive, violently battle-scarred hand. His long fingers trembled, just slightly, betraying his iron control, as he gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from Evie's face. His rough thumb grazed her frostbitten cheek with such agonizing, heartbreaking care. A jolt of pure, liquid electricity shot violently through her skin at his gentle touch, warming her freezing blood instantly. Garrick's intense gaze flicked briefly to his peacefully sleeping son in her arms, a look of profound, devastating gratitude crossing his hardened, scarred features before his golden eyes locked intensely back onto her wide, shocked ones. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, gravelly rumble that resonated straight into her bones, officially claiming her before the entire terrified court. Mine. The silence that crashed over the grand ballroom of the royal estate was absolute. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the suffocating, heavy stillness of a world being violently rewritten. The word thundered through their newly awakened bond like a war drum. Evangeline's breath hitched, her lungs suddenly full of the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of deep forest cedar and burning embers. The freezing black frost that had coated little Nicholas's skin was already melting away, turning to harmless droplets of water wherever her hands cradled him. But Evie could barely focus on the miracle of the child's healing. The Lycan King's golden eyes were entirely consumed by the primal, possessive gaze of his inner wolf. The sheer gravity of his presence, the raw, unfiltered power of his Lycan aura, pressed down on the room until the lesser wolves in the crowd were forced onto their knees. Then the silence shattered. "Her?" Lady Patricia's voice sliced through the heavy air, shrill and dripping with aristocratic revulsion. She stepped forward, her expensive silk skirts swishing angrily over the iced floor. "You cannot be serious, King Garrick. She is a maid, a common, filthy servant. She touched the royal heir without permission. She should be executed for her insolence, not." A low, vibrating growl ripped from King Garrick's chest. It was a sound that belonged to ancient battlefields and blood-soaked snow. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply turned his head, the silver crest of Valdris gleaming on his massive hand, and pinned Lady Patricia with a look of such absolute, frozen death that the colour drained instantly from her aristocratic face. Evie didn't know the Lycan King could see through glamours. She didn't know he could feel the deep, soothing resonance of her hidden lunar lineage. And she definitely didn't know how to be the mate of the most terrifying monarch in the Lycan world. All she knew was the sudden, overwhelming terror of 100 hostile eyes fixed upon her, the sheer vulnerability of being exposed. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Gently, reverently, she transferred the sleeping weight of the little prince into his father's waiting, battle-scarred arms. Garrick's hand, so lethal only moments ago, cradled his disabled son with heartbreaking tenderness. As the physical connection between Evie and Garrick broke, a hollow ache immediately bloomed in her chest. She stepped backward, and then she turned and fled. King Garrick did not chase her, not yet. He watched her leave like a man, watching his own heart walk out of his chest. His priority was the fragile pulse of his son beating steadily against his armor, and the immediate eradication of the threats in his court. "This ceremony is over," Garrick declared, his voice a blade of dark ice cutting through the ballroom, his golden eyes locked onto Lady Patricia and her pale, trembling ally, Lady Cynthia. "You turned your backs on my son. You looked at my heir with disgust. Pack your things. If either of you are still within the walls of this castle by dawn, I will personally feed you to the shadow wolves." He didn't wait for their stammered apologies. Cradling Nicholas tightly, Garrick turned and strode out of the ballroom, his heavy boots echoing like a death knell against the stone. The journey to the servants' quarters took only minutes, but to Evie it felt like a lifetime. The corridors grew progressively darker and colder the further she moved from the royal wing, until she was finally standing in her freezing, drafty room. Her hands shook violently as she began frantically shoving her few threadbare dresses into a canvas sack. The cracked plaster walls offered no protection from the biting winter wind that seeped through the window panes. She was a maid, an Omega. In the brutal hierarchy of the Lycan world, Omegas like her were meant to be invisible. They were tools, servants, or worse, breeding stock for aggressive alphas. For years, Evie had survived by making herself entirely unremarkable. She had masked her rare lavender scent with harsh lye soap and ash. She had hidden her ancient lunar lineage beneath layers of coarse, ill-fitting wool. She had learned to swallow her pride, to keep her eyes lowered, and to never, ever draw the attention of a predator, because drawing attention only brought pain. Now, she had not only drawn the attention of an alpha, she had triggered the fated mate bond of the sovereign himself. It was a complication a ruler of his stature would surely want erased. He needed a high-born Luna to secure his political alliances, not a broken, nameless Omega who slept on a straw mattress. She fully expected the royal guards to burst in, to drag her down to the damp, lightless dungeons for the crime of existing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to run. She needed to disappear into the frozen northern forests before they came for her. But the heavy wooden door didn't burst open. It was pushed open, slowly, deliberately. Garrick filled the entire doorframe, ducking his head slightly to enter the cramped, miserable room. The air temperature immediately spiked. The freezing drafts vanished, chased away by the sheer radiating heat of his lichen blood. Nicholas was still asleep in his arms, his small chest rising and falling in the first peaceful rhythm he had known in years. Evie backed against the cracked plaster wall, her spine stiffening in pure terror. She dropped into a deep curtsy, keeping her eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his heavy combat boots. "My king!" she breathed, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to remain stoic. "Do not bow to me," Garrick rasped. The command was torn from his throat, ragged and desperate. "Never to me, Evangeline." Before she could process the sound of her name on his tongue, the mighty Lycan King, the ruler of Valdris, the terror of the Northern Territories, went down on one knee on the filthy wooden floor. He lowered his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck to her in the ultimate display of Lycan submission. "You healed him," Garrick whispered, his voice cracking with a father's profound relief and a mate's terrifying devotion. They all looked at him like he was a monster, but you ran to him, you bled for him. He looked up, his molten gold eyes searching her storm-glass grey ones. The bond snapped into place the moment your scent hit my lungs. I know what they say of me. I know I am a beast hardened by war, but I swear to you on my life, my crown, and my wolf, if you come with me you will never know the cold again. Not used, not owned, chosen. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome of her past, Evie had learned to live in silence. But this was not a demand. It was a plea from a broken king. Some wounds could only be healed with love. Evie slowly reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the dark, coarse hair at his temple. A river of liquid silver warmth exploded down her arm, lighting up the dark corners of her soul. "Take us home," she whispered. The transition to the king's private inner wing was like stepping into another world. The massive iron-wrought doors sealed away the harsh, unforgiving politics of the castle. Inside, the sanctuary was a masterpiece of warmth and security. Roaring hearths blazed with eternal fires, thick furs covered the floors, and the air was perpetually thick with the comforting scent of cedar and embers. Mrs. Croft, the stern head housekeeper, stood at the entrance. The formidable woman usually ruled the castle staff with an iron fist, but as Garrick carried his sleeping son past the threshold, Mrs. Croft's stern exterior crumbled. She had wide, tear-filled eyes, silently taking Evie's canvas sack from her hands as if the cheap, frayed fabric were spun from solid gold. Without a single word of judgment, Mrs. Croft draped a heavy, impossibly soft wolf-pelt blanket over Evie's trembling shoulders, recognizing her instantly not as a maid, but as the true Luna of Valdris. Dr. Julian Mercer, the dedicated royal physician, was waiting frantically near the roaring fire of the prince's bedchamber. He had spent the last 5 years failing to cure the prince's magical affliction, watching helplessly as the curse slowly drained the boy's life. He clutched his leather medical bag, his face pale with exhaustion, preparing for the worst. But as Garrick laid a peacefully sleeping Nicholas into his massive fur-lined bed, Dr. Mercer could only stare in open-mouthed awe. The physician rushed forward, his hands glowing faintly with diagnostic magic as he scanned the boy's chest. "His pulse is entirely stable," Dr. Mercer breathed, his voice shaking in disbelief. "The Black Frost, it's gone. The magic-induced panic attacks have completely ceased." "I don't understand," I've brought the greatest lichen healers and ancient witches to this room, and none could pierce the curse's barrier. Sire, how is this possible? Garrick didn't answer. He simply looked at Evie, who was standing quietly near the doorway, her hands folded over the thick fur blanket. Dr. Mercer followed the king's gaze, his eyes widening as he registered the faint, soothing aroma of lavender filling the room. You? He asked gently. How did you do it, child? The frost feeds on the body's natural panic response, Evie explained softly, stepping closer to the bed. Traditional lichen magic is too aggressive. It fights the curse, which only makes the ice spread faster. He needed to be anchored, calm. I used the scent of my lineage to lower his heart rate, but it won't hold forever. He needs midnight orchid tea. It is a rare herbal infusion. If I can brew it for him daily, the alchemical properties will neutralize the residual magic in his blood. Dr. Mercer stared at her, profound respect dawning in his eyes. Midnight orchid tea, he murmured. I have read of it in the ancient texts, but no living apothecary has the alchemical affinity required to brew it without turning the leaves to ash. You are remarkable. Over the next 2 weeks, the sanctuary became a cocoon of healing. Evie discovered that her unique lavender scent was only part of her hidden gift. She possessed an innate, ancient knowledge of herbal alchemy. Every evening, as the winter storm raged uselessly against the thick glass windows, she stood by the roaring hearth in the private kitchen attached to the king's chambers and brewed the tea. The rare, soothing herbal infusion was notoriously difficult to prepare, requiring an exact temperature and a gentle, magical coaxing that only Evie seemed capable of providing. She would crush the dried petals with deliberate, rhythmic motions, humming a quiet lullaby that resonated with her lunar magic. The steam from the delicate porcelain cups smelled of sweet earth and twilight. When she coaxed Nicholas to drink it, the last lingering traces of his magical seizures dissolved like shadows in the sun. Garrick watched her every single day. He watched her sit on the edge of the bed and read to his visually impaired son, her voice a soft, steady melody that guided the 5-year-old boy safely through the darkness of his diminished sight. He watched Nicholas laugh for the first time in his life, a bright, joyous sound that made the terrifying Lichen King drop his face into his scarred hands and quietly weep by the fire. And slowly, carefully, Garrick began to map Evie's soul. He never pushed. He never demanded his rights as an alpha or a mate. He simply surrounded her with an impenetrable wall of safety. His heavy, lethal hands were always gentle, always asking for silent permission before he touched the small of her waist or brushed a stray lock of hair from her eyes. The golden thread of their mate bond thickened with every passing day, glowing with a steady, unbreakable heat that chased away the ghosts of Evie's past. But outside the iron-wrought doors of the sanctuary, the royal keep was festering with venom. In the freezing, secluded eastern wing, Lady Patricia paced frantically across the stone floor, her breath plumbing in the frigid air. The lunar crown had been her birthright. Her powerful father, a high-ranking duke, had spent years positioning her to take the throne, to rule the northern lichens with an iron fist, and to quietly dispose of the king's defective, disabled pup once she wore the crown. Now she had been exiled, humiliated, replaced by a nobody. We are ruined, Lady Cynthia whimpered from a velvet chair, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders. The king's guards are escorting us to the borders tomorrow at dawn. It's over, Patricia. He will kill us if we stay. It is not over, Patricia hissed, her eyes wild with a feral, toxic ambition. I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that common trash to sit on my throne. She stopped pacing and walked over to her heavy oak vanity. From a hidden, velvet-lined compartment, she withdrew a small lead crystal vial. The liquid inside was a sickly, pale yellow, viscous and unnatural in the dim candlelight. Lady Cynthia gasped, scrambling backward in her chair until her back hit the wall. Is that... Patricia, are you insane? That is aconite extract, a lethal, slow-acting wolfsbane poison, Patricia murmured, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting her beautiful aristocratic features. used to target shifters, odorless when mixed with certain herbs, tasteless once it hits the tongue. The king keeps them locked safely in his sanctuary, but that stupid maid still insists on brewing that pathetic herbal tea for the crippled brat every single night. I paid one of the kitchen boys a heavy pouch of gold to intercept Mrs. Croft's daily supply basket. "If you kill the king's mate, he will tear us apart piece by piece," Cynthia sobbed, burying her face in her hands. If the mate bond is severed by death, King Garrick will be driven entirely mad by the grief. He will lose his mind, his wolf will turn completely feral, and my father's army will sweep in to take the throne from a broken beast to restore order. Patricia sneered, carefully wrapping the deadly vial in a silk handkerchief. And if the crippled boy drinks it first, even better, the maid will be blamed for poisoning the royal heir. Either way, she dies, and I will watch. By the 10th day of the first month, the sanctuary was a haven of domestic peace. Evie stood in the small private kitchen attached to the king's chambers, humming softly as she crushed the dried petals for the midnight orchid tea. The fire crackled merrily in the grate. Nicholas was sitting on the thick rug in the next room, his small fingers carefully tracing the raised lettering of a wooden book Garrick had carved specifically for him. Mrs. Croft had delivered the basket of rare herbs earlier that afternoon. Evie was completely unaware the basket had been left unattended in the lower halls for exactly 3 minutes. She had no idea that the dried orchids had been soaked in a pale yellow liquid and left to dry near the hearth until the poison was virtually undetectable. She poured the boiling water over the crushed petals. The steam rose, but the usual sweet scent of twilight seemed slightly muted today, masked by a faint, almost metallic tang that Evie chalked up to the heat of the copper kettle. She poured a small amount of the dark brew into a delicate teacup. Nicholas's stomach was sensitive, and the magic in his blood was volatile. She always tested the temperature and the alchemical balance of the brew herself before offering it to the young prince. Evie brought the cup to her lips and took a deep swallow. The reaction was not instantaneous. Aconite extract was designed to be insidious, a coward's weapon meant to bypass Lycan's rapid healing by disguising itself as a harmless cold chill before it violently struck the heart. Evie set the cup down. A strange, unnatural numbness prickled at the very tip of her tongue. She blinked, shaking her head as a sudden, massive wave of dizziness washed over her. The deep, comforting warmth of the roaring hearth seemed to vanish instantly, replaced by a violent localized winter exploding inside her veins. "Evie," Nicholas's small voice called out from the rug. "Is the tea ready? It smells sharp. Just a moment, sweetheart," Evie managed to say, but her voice sounded horribly wrong. It was slurred, incredibly heavy. She tried to take a step forward toward the doorway, but her legs refused to obey her commands. The numbness rapidly accelerated into a searing, agonizing fire that ripped through her digestive tract. It felt as though she had swallowed molten glass. She gasped, her hands flying to her throat as her windpipe began to rapidly constrict, suffocating her. The delicate porcelain teacup slipped from her violently trembling fingers. It hit the stone floor, shattering into 100 jagged pieces. The dark liquid splashed across the stones, sizzling faintly as the potent wolfsbane ate away at the stone. Then the golden thread of the mate bond, the warm, brilliant connection that had anchored her to Garrick's soul for the past 10 days, violently snapped. In the main throne room, 3 wings away, King Garrick was standing over a massive map table with his generals, discussing the security of the northern borders. He was in mid-sentence when the catastrophic biological feedback hit him. The Lycan King dropped to his knees with a sound that wasn't human. It was the horrific, gut-wrenching roar of a beast having its heart ripped from its chest while still beating. The sheer force of his sudden, violent agony sent a shockwave of raw, unfiltered Lycan power exploding outward. The massive stained glass windows of the throne room blew out entirely, raining colored glass down onto the snow-covered courtyard below. The heavy oak table splintered into kindling under his gripping hands. King Garrick! The generals shouted in pure terror, drawing their blades in confusion. Garrick couldn't breathe. His eyes had shifted completely from amber to the terrifying, glowing molten gold of a fully enraged Lycan. The comforting warmth of his mate bond had turned to freezing, toxic ash in his mind. "Evangeline," he snarled. Blood dripped from his lips where his fangs had suddenly elongated and violently pierced his own flesh. He didn't run. He erupted. He moved faster than the human eye could track, a blur of monstrous, unstoppable violence, tearing through the corridors of the frozen citadel, leaving a trail of shattered stone and terrified guards in his wake. There would be no negotiations, no begging, no mercy. He was going to burn the entire kingdom to the ground, but before the ashes could fall, he had to save his heart. The physical distance between the main throne room and the private inner wing was a labyrinth of heavy stone corridors, towering iron gates, and winding staircases meant to slow an invading army. For a normal Lycan warrior, the desperate sprint would take several minutes of agonizing, lung-burning effort. King Garrick Valerius crossed the distance in a fraction of that time. He moved not as a monarch, but as a devastating force of nature, a blur of pure, feral desperation tearing through the winter castle. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary did not just swing open. They were violently blasted off their wrought iron hinges by the sheer kinetic impact of his arrival. The massive slabs of ancient wood splintered into jagged kindling, raining across the thick furs of the antechamber in a shower of destruction. Garrick vaulted through the settling dust, his lungs burning, his molten gold eyes scanning the space with frantic predatory speed. The private kitchen was a scene of quiet, horrifying devastation. The delicate porcelain teacup lay shattered in 100 glittering pieces across the stone floor, a dark, viscous puddle seeping into the grout, and in the center of the room, lying completely motionless, was Evangeline. Evie, the mighty Lycan king, dropped to his knees with such crushing force that the ancient floorboards groaned in protest. He slid the last few feet, completely ignoring the razor-sharp shards of porcelain slicing into his heavy leather trousers. Next to the motionless Omega, little Nicholas was curled into a tight, trembling ball, his unseeing storm-glass grey eyes wide with blind terror, his tiny hands desperately clutching the collar of Evie's grey wool dress. The boy was sobbing, a breathless, broken sound that echoed the exact cadence of Garrick's own shattered soul. Garrick reached out, his massive, battle-scarred hands trembling violently as he pulled the fragile Omega into his broad chest. She was so incredibly cold. The radiant, sun-warmed heat that usually followed her like a physical halo was entirely gone, replaced by the biting chill of the grave. Her pale skin had taken on an unnatural, translucent pallor, and a horrifying network of jagged black veins was rapidly creeping up her delicate throat like the roots of a dead tree. The sickening, metallic stench of aconite extract hung heavy in the air, a rotting, mesmerical scent that violently overpowered her natural, soothing lavender aroma. The poison was actively burning through her system, suffocating her hidden lunar magic with every agonizing second. The golden thread of their mate bond, usually a steady river of light and warmth within his mind, was nothing but a frayed, agonizingly silent void, a hollow ache. "Stay with me," Garrick rasped, his voice tearing at the seams, stripped of all royal authority. He pressed 2 trembling fingers to the side of her neck. The pulse was there, but it was dangerously faint, a fragile, fluttering butterfly trapped beneath thick winter ice. "Do not leave me in the dark. Evangeline, open your eyes. That is an order." Heavy footsteps echoed wildly down the corridor. Dr. Julian Mercer burst into the ruined kitchen, his leather medical bag already swinging open. The royal physician took one look at the black veins snaking up the maid's throat and dropped to the floor next to the sovereign, his face draining of all color. "Wolfsbane!" The doctor breathed in pure horror, his hands flying blindly to his high vials of aconite extract, highly concentrated. "Sire, her heart rate is plummeting drastically. She does not have the robust cellular regeneration of an alpha. This dosage was meant to stop a fully grown Lycan warrior's heart in minutes. It is eating her alive. Fix her. It was not a request. It was a terrifying guttural command vibrating with lethal intent. I cannot purge it fast enough, Dr. Mercer admitted, his hands shaking as he desperately uncorked a vial of glowing blue tincture. The poison has already bound to her bloodstream. The only thing that can burn aconite from the veins of a wolf is pure, raw alpha vitality. But the shock of the transfer could. Before the physician could finish his sentence, Garrick shifted his grip. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The king raised his own right hand, extending a single, razor-sharp lichen claw, and ruthlessly sliced it across his opposite palm. Dark, heavily enchanted alpha blood welled to the surface instantly, radiating a staggering, impossible heat that smelled of deep forests and ancient power. Garrick gently supported the back of Evie's head, tilting her delicate chin upward. He pressed his bleeding palm against her pale, parted lips, allowing his thick, pulsing life force to drip past her teeth. "Drink, my quiet moon," he whispered fiercely into her hair, his golden eyes blazing with a defiant, possessive fury that dared the very gods of death to intervene. "Take everything you need. Drain me dry if you must. I would rather burn with you than freeze alone. Fight it." The reaction was violently physical. The moment the potent, ancient blood of the Valerius line hit her tongue, Evie's body arched rigidly off the cold stone floor. A sharp, breathless gasp ripped from her throat. Beneath her skin, a terrifying war erupted. The deep, royal gold of the Alpha's healing magic clashed directly with the suffocating black poison. The temperature in the room skyrocketed, turning the frigid kitchen into a sweltering furnace. Dr. Mercer watched in stunned, breathless silence as the jagged black veins on her throat slowly, agonizingly stopped spreading. The Omega's chest he heaved, pulling in a massive, shuddering breath that rattled in her lungs. The aconite extract was not completely gone, but the lethal progression had been violently halted. She was anchored. Garrick collapsed forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the faint, desperately returning scent of lavender mixed with his own heavy cedar. He wrapped his massive arms around her fragile frame, burying his face in her hair, and closed his eyes. "Clear my chambers," the king commanded, his voice a low, exhausted rumble against her skin. "No one enters the inner wing. No one leaves. If the shadows move without my permission, kill them." Beneath the heavy, anchoring weight of his arms, the frantic, terrified fluttering in her chest slowly leveled out, her fragile heartbeat finally surrendering to the overwhelming, protective heat of the Alpha's blood. Darkness claimed her. It was not the terrifying, suffocating void of the poison, but a heavy, medicinal slumber. For an eternity, Evangeline drifted in a suspended state between consciousness and dreams. She felt the searing, molten gold fire in her veins, slowly cooling into a deep, vibrating warmth that pulsed in time with another heart. She felt the phantom sensation of a massive, protective weight curled around her, anchoring her spirit to the mortal plane. When Evie finally opened her eyes, the transition was achingly slow. She expected the cracked plaster ceiling of her freezing servants' quarters. She expected the harsh, biting draft of the winter wind rattling the loose window panes. Instead, her storm-glass grey eyes fluttered open to a canopy of deep, rich crimson velvet. She blinked, her vision slowly adjusting to the soft golden light of a roaring hearth. The air was incredibly thick, heavily saturated with the intoxicating, grounding scent of cedar, burning embers, and a faint hint of Dr. Mercer's medical herbs. Evie tried to shift her weight and immediately realized she was buried beneath a mountain of impossible softness. Thick, luxurious wolf pelts, woven thermal blankets, and dozens of plush-down pillows surrounded her in a perfect, impenetrable circle. It was a nesting room, the ultimate, primal display of an Alpha's protective instinct. Someone had systematically dismantled the massive royal bed and rebuilt it entirely around her fragile body, creating a sanctuary where no cold, no threat, and no fear could ever reach her. "Easy, child. Do not try to sit up yet." The voice was stern, but it cracked with an emotion Evie had never heard before. She slowly turned her head. Miriam Croft sat in a high-backed wooden chair close to the bed. The formidable head housekeeper looked entirely out of place in the opulent royal chambers. Her usually immaculate grey hair was completely dishevelled, and dark, heavy bags hung beneath her weeping eyes. In her hands, Mrs. Croft held a warm, damp cloth, which she had clearly been using to wipe the sweat from the girl's feverish brow for days. "Mrs. Croft," Evie rasped. Her throat felt incredibly raw, like she had swallowed handfuls of crushed glass. "Hush," the older woman murmured, leaning forward to gently press the warm cloth to Evie's cheek. "You gave us a terrible fright, Evangeline. The entire castle has been holding its breath for 3 days. Dr. Mercer said, your hidden lunar magic, combined with the king's blood, was the only thing that kept your heart beating against the poison." 3 days. Evie's mind struggled to process the massive gap in time. The last thing she remembered was the metallic tang of the midnight orchid tea, the sudden violent paralysis gripping her limbs, and the terrifying sound of the teacup shattering against the floor. "Nicholas," she gasped, a sudden spike of primal, maternal panic overriding her physical weakness. She tried to push herself up, her pale fingers gripping the thick furs. "The tea. Did he drink the tea?" No, my brave girl. The prince is safe," a deep, exhausted voice answered from the doorway. Evie froze. King Garrick stepped out of the heavy shadows of the antechamber. The sight of the most feared Lycan monarch in the Northern Territories made her breath catch painfully in her chest. He looked absolutely devastated. The pristine, intimidating armor of the sovereign was gone. He wore only a simple loose linen shirt that was heavily stained with dried blood, his own blood. His dark hair was wild, his strong jaw shadowed with days of rough stubble. But it was his eyes that truly struck her. The burning, molten gold was completely exposed, stripped of all emotional barriers, raw and bleeding with a vulnerability that defied his terrifying reputation. He crossed the massive room in 3 long strides. Mrs. Croft offered a deep, silent curtsy and immediately stepped away, slipping out of the heavy oak doors to give them absolute privacy. Garrick stopped at the edge of the nesting bed. He did not loom over her. Instead, the massive warrior slowly, deliberately lowered his towering frame, sinking down onto the thick carpet near the mattress until his head was level with hers. Even lying in a bed of silk and fur, facing the absolute ruler of her world, she angled her face downward, maintaining a rigid, formal stance. Old habits of survival were hard to break. Evie instinctively tried to shift backward, preparing to offer that submissive apology expected of an Omega who had caused such a massive disruption to the royal household. "Do not," Garrick whispered, his large hands coming up to gently, reverently frame her face, stopping her retreat. His touch was incredibly warm, the rough calluses on his palms scraping softly against her pale skin. "Do not shrink away from me, Evangeline, not ever again." "I failed to detect the poison, my king," she murmured, her voice breaking as the heavy weight of her failure crashed down upon her. "I brewed the tea. I should have known. If Nico had taken the cup before me—" "Stop!" Garrick's voice broke entirely. He pressed his forehead gently against hers, closing his eyes as a violent shudder ripped through his massive shoulders. "You drank the venom meant for my son. You took the killing blow meant to shatter my empire. You have nothing to apologize for. The fault is entirely mine for allowing those vipers to remain within striking distance of my family." The word settled heavily in the quiet space between them. Family. Evie opened her eyes, looking directly into the golden fire of his gaze. The severed bond within her chest, which had been a hollow, agonizing ache for 3 days, suddenly flared back to life. It was no longer a fragile thread. It was a thick, burning river of liquid silver stitching their souls together with a relentless, undeniable force. She could feel his powerful heartbeat thudding against her own ribs. She could feel his terror, his profound relief, and an ocean of protective fury that he was keeping tightly leashed just for her. "They targeted you because of me," Garrick continued, his thumb slowly tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. Because they realized what I knew the moment you stepped into the frost to save my boy. You are the heart of this pack. You are my mate." He pulled back just slightly, his expression hardening into absolute, unwavering conviction. "I failed to protect you once. I swear upon the graves of my ancestors it will never happen again. This room, this entire castle is yours. You are not a servant. You are not an afterthought. You are chosen." Evie's lower lip trembled. For years she had endured the mockery of the court, the harsh labor of the kitchens, the constant draining effort to remain invisible. She had accepted her lot in life with quiet dignity. But looking at the terrifying king of Valdris, a man who commanded legions of shadow wolves and bowed to no one, kneeling on the floor just to be closer to her, the heavy armor around her own heart began to crack and fall away. She slowly reached out from beneath the heavy furs. Her slender, pale fingers hesitated for a second, before gently tangling in the dark, unruly hair at the nape of his neck. Garrick let out a ragged, breathless sigh. He turned his face into her palm, pressing a soft, lingering kiss against the center of her hand. The simple, domestic intimacy of the gesture was more powerful than any formal, claiming bite. It was a vow, written in the quiet language of survival. "Rest now," the king whispered, gently pulling the heavy wolf pelts higher around her shoulders, tucking her securely into the nest. "I will be right here. I will stand guard until the sun burns out." The transition from the shadow of death back to life was measured not in hours, but in the slow, rhythmic beats of quiet afternoons. 5 days passed. The oppressive, blinding winter storms continued to rage furiously outside the thick glass windows of the winter castle, battering the ancient stone walls with relentless sheets of ice and snow. But inside the private royal wing, the temperature remained a perpetual, comforting haven of warmth. Evie's physical strength returned slowly, aided by Dr. Mercer's meticulous care and the lingering, powerful effects of Garrick's blood in her veins. The raw burn in her throat had faded to a dull ache, and the terrifying black veins had completely vanished from her skin, leaving behind only a faint, silvery scarring that Garrick treated with absolute reverence every single morning. It was mid-afternoon. The golden light of the roaring hearth cast long, dancing shadows across the thick-woven rugs of the antechamber. Evie sat cross-legged on the floor, wearing a loose, incredibly soft tunic made of spun white wool that Mrs. Croft had brought her. The coarse, scratchy grey uniform of her past felt like a distant, fading nightmare. At her right hand, little Nicholas was entirely absorbed in his task. The 5-year-old prince sat on a plush velvet cushion, a set of intricately carved wooden blocks scattered around his small knees. Because of the lingering effects of the ancient curse, Nico's vision was severely limited, a cloudy, storm-glass grey that only allowed him to see vague shapes and shifting light. For years, the arrogant royal tutors had ignored him, deeming him too broken to teach. Evie refused to accept that. She picked up one of the heavy oak blocks. Instead of standard letters, Garrick had spent the last few nights sitting by the fire, using his razor-sharp lichen claws to meticulously carve deep, textured patterns into the wood, mountains, wolves, the phases of the moon. "Here, little wolf," Evie murmured softly, her voice a gentle melodic anchor in the quiet room. She guided Nico's small, trembling hand toward the block. "Feel the edge. Do you feel the sharp peaks?" Nico's tiny fingers traced the deeply grooved lines, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, his cloudy eyes staring blankly ahead, but his tactile senses were remarkably sharp. "It goes up and down, like the teeth of the mountains outside the window." "Exactly," Evie smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her pale features. The heavy, soothing scent of sun-warmed lavender and summer rain rolled off her shoulders, filling the room with a palpable, physical calm. "The Dragon's Spine Mountains. And what lives in the mountains?" "The shadow wolves," Nico answered proudly, a small, genuine smile breaking across his delicate face. He dropped the block and immediately leaned sideways, burying his face into Evie's shoulder. He inhaled deeply, his small hands gripping the fabric of her white tunic. "You smell better than the mountains, Evie." You smell like the sun." Evie wrapped her arms securely around the child, resting her chin softly on the top of his dark curls. The magical parasitic black frost that had once threatened to consume his fragile body every time his heart rate spiked was entirely dormant. It had been starved out. The curse fed on fear, isolation, and panic. Surrounded by the absolute, unwavering safety of a mother's unconditional love, the dark magic had simply withered away, finding no purchase in a heart that was completely full. Standing silently in the arched doorway of his private study, King Garrick watched them. The massive Lycan warrior leaned his heavy shoulder against the stone frame, his muscular arms crossed over his chest. He made no sound. He completely suppressed his imposing, lethal aura, refusing to disturb the sacred, incredibly fragile piece of the scene unfolding on his rug. For the first time in 5 agonizing years, his son was not in pain. For the first time in his long, blood-soaked life, Garrick's inner beast was completely, utterly at peace. The hollow, echoing void inside his chest had been entirely filled by the quiet, dignified woman sitting on his floor. Garrick's golden eyes tracked the slow, graceful movements of Evie's hands as she guided his son. He noted the slight hesitation in her wrists, the lingering ghost of the poison's trauma, and a dark, dangerous thrill of violent protectiveness spiked in his blood. The bond connecting them hummed with a deep, resonant vibration. She was healing, yes. She was safe within the impenetrable walls of his nesting room. But out there, beyond the heavy iron gates of the sanctuary, the perpetrators still breathed. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, and the arrogance of the high nobility had finally bitten off more than it could chew. They had no inkling the Alpha King could see through glamours. They didn't realize the Omega they targeted carried a hidden ancient lunar lineage, and they definitely were oblivious that striking the fated mate of the ruling monarch was a declaration of absolute war. They had conspired. They had brought poison into his home. They had poured aconite extract into a teacup meant to shatter his family, and they had caused his mate's heart to stop. Garrick pushed himself off the cold stone doorframe. The soft, domestic warmth in his golden eyes hardened instantly into the cold, calculating stare of a lethal predator preparing for a slaughter. Some wounds could only be healed with love. It was true, but justice could only be delivered with blood. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the sweet scent of lavender and cedar settle deep into his lungs, anchoring his soul before the coming storm. He would give his mate and his son this perfect, quiet afternoon. He would let them rest in the absolute safety of his shadow, and by midnight, the winter castle of Valdris would witness the true, terrifying wrath of an Alpha King defending his Luna. The descent into the holding cells beneath the winter castle of Valdris was a descent into the belly of a beast. The air grew impossibly dense, damp earth, crushed stone, iron rust, and beneath it all the sharp acidic stench of pure unadulterated terror. King Garrick moved without a single sound. He did not stride. He stalked, the predator unleashed. Frost clung to the rusted iron bars lining the corridor, but it melted into hissing steam the moment his towering frame passed. His golden eyes, usually shielded by a flawless mask of cold royal indifference, now burned with the molten intensity of a dying sun. The golden thread of his mate bond thrummed violently in his chest, a constant, painful reminder of how dangerously close he had come to losing the one soul meant for his. Evangeline, Evie. The name was a sacred prayer, and a violent war drum beating against his ribs. Mrs. Croft stood in the very center of the interrogation chamber. The stern head housekeeper of the royal palace was a pillar of immovable stone amid the subterranean gloom. She held her spine perfectly straight, her face a mask of chilling stoicism. At her feet knelt the kitchen boy. The boy was shivering so violently, his knees knocked against the unforgiving cobblestone in a rapid, sickening rhythm. His teeth chattered, a frantic staccato that echoed off the damp walls. He smelled of sweat, urine, and the bitter tang of absolute regret. He was a pawn, but the beast inside Garrick cared nothing for distinctions. The beast only knew that its mate had been harmed. Garrick stopped, Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that inevitably precedes an avalanche. On the rusted iron table between them sat the remnants of a shattered reality. A small glass vial cracked down the center, containing a few remaining drops of a viscous, sickly sweet liquid. Aconite extract, a lethal, slow-acting wolfsbane poison used to target shifters. Beside it lay a heavy pouch of gold coins, the velvet stained with dirt from where the boy had tried to bury it behind the stables. And finally, a pristine white lace handkerchief, delicately embroidered with 2 interlocking letters. S. and T. Garrick stared at the vial. He didn't just see the poison, he felt it. He felt the phantom echo of Evie's heartbeat stuttering, the terrifying drop in her core body temperature, the tragic way her beautiful lavender scent had soured into the smell of wilted grief as she collapsed into his arms. His fated mate had tasted death because of the liquid in that glass. "Speak," Garrick commanded. His voice was not a roar. It was a low, guttural rasp that vibrated the very stones beneath their feet. It was the voice of the Lycan King, stripped of all human restraint. The boy sobbed, a wretched, tearing sound that echoed in the dark. "I didn't know, my king. I swear to the moon goddess. I didn't know what it was. Lady Patricia, she cornered me in the scullery. Lady Cynthia was with her. They said it was just a sleeping draught, something to put the new maid in her place. They gave me the gold. They said if I didn't slip it into the herbs for the midnight orchid tea, my entire family would be thrown out into the freezing wastes." Garrick's jaw tightened. The silver crest of Valdris on his finger dug brutally into his palm as he clenched his fist. The skin broke. A single drop of alpha blood welled up, rich and heavy with ancient power. It fell, striking the stone floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the dark. "You laced the midnight orchid tea," the Garrick repeated, the words tasting like ash on his tongue. The tea Evie brewed exclusively to calm his son's magical fluctuations, the tea that had been their salvation. "Yes, please, mercy. I beg you." The boy crawled forward, his shaking hands reaching for Garrick's boots. Garrick didn't move. He didn't flinch. He merely looked down at the trembling creature. Silence. The single word snapped through the damp air like a whip. The boy's sobbing ceased instantly. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of the Alpha command. He could only weep in mute, suffocating horror, his chest heaving with every jagged breath. Mrs. Croft stepped forward, her sensible shoes clicking sharply against the stone. She used a pair of iron tongs to carefully lift the lace handkerchief. "I found this in the boy's apron, King Garrick. He claims Lady Cynthia dropped it when she handed him the vial." Garrick took the handkerchief. He didn't need to look at the embroidered crest. He brought the delicate fabric to his nose. Crushed roses and an artificial, cloying musk, the signature scents of Patricia Sterling and Cynthia Thorne. Disgust coiled in his gut, thick and venomous. He dropped the lace as if it were coated in a rotting disease, watching it flutter slowly to the filthy floor. The arrogance, the sheer blinding arrogance of those women. They had thought Evie was just a maid, an insignificant obstacle meant to be swept aside. They had no inkling the Alpha King could see through glamours. They didn't realize the Omega they targeted carried a hidden ancient lunar lineage, and they definitely were oblivious that striking the fated mate of the ruling monarch was a declaration of absolute war. "Your life is forfeit by the laws of Valdris," Garrick said softly to the boy. The boy's eyes rolled back in sheer terror. "But you were a weapon wielded by cowards. You are banished from the Winter Castle. If my guards find you within the borders of my territory by dawn, they will not be swift." The boy scrambled backward, weeping openly, bowing his head against the stone in desperate, pathetic gratitude. Mrs. Croft motioned for the dungeon guards to haul him away. When they were entirely alone, Mrs. Croft looked at her king. "The physician says she is resting, King Garrick. Dr. Mercer believes the worst has passed." Garrick closed his eyes. A muscle feathered violently in his jaw. "Watch the inner wing. Miriam, let no one pass. Where are you going, my king?" Garrick turned toward the spiral stairs. The golden fire in his eyes flared, casting long, demonic shadows against the dungeon walls. To clean my house. Far above the damp misery of the dungeons, the eastern wing of the Winter Castle was a portrait of opulent warmth. The guest chambers assigned to the high-ranking noble candidates were draped in heavy crimson velvet and illuminated by roaring hearth fires. Lady Patricia Sterling reclined on a chaise lounge, swirling a goblet of blood-red wine. Her silken robes pooled around her, a picture of aristocratic boredom masking a dangerous, electric anxiety. Across the room, Lady Cynthia Thorne stood by the frosted window, her reflection superposed over the frozen pine forests beyond. "You are pacing again, Cynthia." "It is unbecoming," Patricia murmured, taking a slow sip. The wine tasted sharp, metallic on her tongue. Cynthia turned, her fingers nervously twisting the fine fabric of her skirt. "We haven't heard any news from the servants' quarters. Surely, if the tea had worked, there would be a commotion." "The castle is too quiet." "Quiet is good," Patricia snapped, though her own heart beat a little too fast in her chest. The king is lightly embarrassed. A maid suddenly dying in his private wing, he will have it swept under the rug. He has to. He cannot afford a scandal during the choosing of a queen. "But what of the boy?" Cynthia asked, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "What if the blind prince drank it instead? What if the disabled little wretch?" Then we did the realm a favour. Patricia stood up, her mask of elegant composure slipping entirely to reveal the ugly cruelty beneath. "Look at him, Cynthia. Nicholas is a broken thing, a cursed child having seizures and freezing the ballroom on the first day of the trials. He is unfit to be the heir of Valdris. If that worthless Omega maid perished taking care of him, so be it. The king needs a strong queen, a pureblood, not a weak servant who coddles a defective pup." Cynthia swallowed hard, her eyes wide. "You are right, of course you are right." Patricia smiled, a thin, triumphant line. "By tomorrow the king will realize his folly. He will return to the candidates. He will see that only I—" She stopped. A sudden, violent sweat broke out across Patricia's brow. She gasped, the wine sloshing over the rim of her goblet, staining her fingers red like fresh blood. "Why is it so hot?" Patricia demanded, her voice sharp and breathless. "I don't know," Cynthia breathed. She backed away from the glass. "Patricia, look at the fire." The roaring fire in the massive stone hearth flickered. The orange and yellow flames sputtered, then violently shifted colors. They turned a brilliant, blinding molten gold, and then, with a sound like a roaring furnace, the heat surged outward. The temperature in the room skyrocketed. It did not rise naturally. It felt as though the Royal Alpha's own molten blood had breached the stone floors and wrapped its suffocating, blistering heat around their throats. Patricia gasped for air, and she felt her lungs burn with every frantic inhalation. The crimson velvet tapestries against the walls began to smoulder, a thick layer of smoke blooming across the fabric in jagged, predatory patterns. The heavy gold necklace around Patricia's throat began to heat up, searing her skin as the Alpha's aura dominated the room. "What is this?" Cynthia whimpered, sweating profusely, and wrapping her arms around herself in a desperate, futile attempt to find comfort. It wasn't just heat, it was pressure, a suffocating, crushing weight descending upon the eastern wing. The air grew so dense it felt like drowning in boiling water. It was the physical manifestation of an Alpha's murderous intent. Deep within the inner wing, shielded by heavy oak doors and ancient wards, the royal nesting chambers remained an impenetrable fortress of comfort. Evangeline Vance lay buried beneath layers of thick furs on the massive four-poster bed. Over the span of 5 agonizing days, spent in total guarded seclusion, this bed had become her entire world. Her skin, usually a radiant golden hue, was finally regaining its warmth after nearly a week of porcelain fragile recovery under the soft glow of the hearth. The lingering trace of midnight orchid tea hung in the air, the silent, fragrant proof of the soothing brews she had meticulously prepared for Nico before the betrayal. She was breathing, slow, steady, rhythmic breaths that filled the room with the delicate, soothing scent of lavender and sun-warmed earth. She was not fully asleep, nor fully awake. The venom had been purged, but she still floated in the liminal space of recovery, anchored to the world by two distinct things. The first was the molten golden thread of the mate bond, pulsing deep within her chest. It had been agonizingly silent when the aconite extract stopped her heart. Now fed by the alpha blood Garrick had forced past her lips, the bond was a roaring river of liquid fire, keeping the shadows at bay. She could feel him through it. She could feel the terrifying, scorching expanse of his rage expanding outward, searching for the ones who had hurt her. "I am here," she sent through the bond, a soft, soothing hum of lavender meant to temper his beast. "I am safe." The second anchor was smaller, a fragile, trembling weight pressed firmly against her side. Nicholas, the 5-year-old prince, was curled into a tight ball, his face buried against Evie's ribcage. He was shaking. It was not the violent, magical seizure of black frost that had gripped him in the ballroom. It was the residual trauma of a child who had nearly watched his savior die. Nico's unseeing eyes were squeezed shut, his tiny fingers locked in a death grip around the carved wooden blocks his father had made for him. "Nico," Evie rasped. Her throat still felt like it was lined with shattered glass, but she forced the word out. The boy let out a broken sob. "Evie, you went quiet. You almost left. I am here now." "Sweet boy," she whispered, her voice a fragile, beautiful melody. Over these 5 days of seclusion, Evie had slowly regained enough strength to sit up. She forced her heavy, leaden arm to move, wrapping it around his small, trembling shoulders. She pulled him closer, enveloping him entirely in her warm maternal aura. Nico pressed his face harder against her. His trembling began to ease as he breathed in her deep scent. The lavender worked like magic, because it was magic. Her hidden ancient lunar lineage, dormant for so long, flared to life to protect the cursed child of the formidable sovereign. "Feel," Evie murmured softly, guiding Nico's hand. He held up one of the carved wooden blocks. Evie traced her fingers over the deep, tactile grooves, letting Nico follow her movements. The rough grain of the wood, the intricate patterns of wolves and moons Garrick had painstakingly carved so his visually impaired son could see the world through touch. "Feel the wolf," Evie whispered in the quiet sanctuary. "He is strong. He protects the pack, just like your father." Nico sniffled, his small fingers tracing the wooden wolf. "Father is angry. The air feels hot. It feels like fire." Evie closed her eyes, resting her cheek against the boy's soft hair. "He is angry because he loves us. Because he is keeping the monsters away." She kept her arm wrapped tightly around the boy. She was an Omega, battered and poisoned, yet in this bed, holding the king's disabled heir, she was the fiercest protector in Valdris. Not used, not owned, chosen, and fiercely, undeniably beloved. They were safe here. The monster roaming the halls outside was theirs. Garrick Valerius did not run. An alpha king dispensing justice never hurries. He walked. His heavy boots struck the stone corridors with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of an executioner's drum. The sound echoed up into the vaulted ceilings, a promise of violence that made the very castle tremble. As he moved from the lower levels toward the eastern wing, the environment reacted to his fury. The torches mounted on the walls flared violently, spitting sparks and roaring with excess heat as he passed. The heavy frost coating the corridor windows instantly melted, turning to streaks of steam that vanished into the suffocating air. The only light that truly mattered came from the predatory, amber fire burning in his eyes. The castle guards stationed along the route did not challenge him. They felt the crushing, burning weight of his aura before they ever saw him. The raw lichen pressure was so intense it forced the oxygen from the air. Grown men, hardened warriors, dropped to their knees, bowing their heads, pressing their faces to the stone floor in total submission as their king stalked past. They couldn't look at him. To look at a lichen king in the throes of a mate-protecting frenzy was to invite immediate death. Garrick's chest expanded with a sharp, burning breath. He could smell them now. The crushed roses, the artificial musk, the repulsive scent of the women who had dared to touch what was his. His hand flexed. The silver crest of Valdris caught the flickering torchlight, gleaming like an executioner's blade. He reached the grand landing of the eastern wing. At the end of the hall stood the massive double doors leading to the noble guests' chambers. They were made of reinforced oak, banded with heavy black iron. Garrick didn't slow his pace. He didn't reach for the handles. He simply hit the doors. The explosion of wood and iron was absolutely deafening. The doors splintered like brittle kindling, bursting inward in a deadly shower of shrapnel. One of the iron hinges shrieked as it was torn completely from the stone wall. The dust settled instantly, forced down by the sheer crushing gravity of his presence. Garrick stepped over the smoking wreckage and into the opulent chamber. Lady Patricia and Lady Cynthia screamed, stumbling backward. The room was sweltering, an absolute oven of lethal intent, and the man standing in the ruined doorway burned with a heat that felt exactly like hellfire. "Your Majesty," Patricia gasped, clutching her velvet robes. Her face drained of all color as she choked on the heavy air. "What is the meaning of this? We are guests of lie." The single word thundered through the room, rattling the window panes. Garrick's voice was not human. It was the ancient guttural snarl of the beast beneath his skin. He stepped forward. The floorboards groaned in blistering agony under his boots. "You are not guests," Garrick said, his golden eyes locking onto Patricia with lethal precision. He raised his hand, opening his palm. Resting on his scarred palm was the pristine white lace handkerchief with the S&T crest. Patricia's eyes snapped to the fabric. Her jaw dropped. A pathetic, strangled sound escaped her throat. Cynthia immediately fell to her knees, weeping hysterically, the heat pressing her to the floor. It was her. It was Patricia. She bought the aconite extract. She forced the boy. I told her not to. I told her the king would find out. "Traitor!" Patricia shrieked, backing away until her spine hit the smouldering stone wall. "She is a liar. King Garrick, you cannot believe this. I am a Sterling. My father is the Duke. You need my family's army. You cannot ruin the trials for a filthy wolfless Omega maid and a broken, blind pup." Garrick stopped a few feet from her. The air around him shimmered with extreme, violent heat. He looked at the woman who had sought to murder the other half of his soul. He looked at the woman who had insulted the son he loved more than life itself. "There is no choosing of candidates," Garrick said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper that cut through the sweltering room like a blade through silk. "And there is only one queen in Valdris." He watched the realization completely shatter Patricia's arrogant facade. He watched the pure, unadulterated terror finally bleed into her eyes as the crushing heat forced her to her knees. "I would burn this entire kingdom to the ground before I allowed anyone to harm them," Garrick promised, his fangs extending, gleaming in the golden light of the smouldering room. "You brought poison into my home. You targeted my mate." Patricia whimpered, sliding all the way down the wall to collapse on the floor. "Please," she breathed, the word a pathetic, broken thing, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Garrick looked down at the arrogant architects of his nightmare. The true justice of Valdris was not delivered by a headsman. It was delivered by the king himself. Now the Alpha King snarled, his shadow expanding to swallow them whole in the blinding heat. "You will learn what hellfire really feels like." The heat that consumed the guest chambers of the eastern wing was not born of wood and spark, but of ancient, volatile blood magic. The roaring flames in the massive stone hearth did not merely spill over. They were entirely eclipsed by the raw, suffocating pressure of King Garrick's aura. The heavy crimson velvet curtains did not catch fire. They simply disintegrated. The fabric blackened, curled, and turned to fine, powdery ash under the sheer, crushing gravity of the Alpha's lethal intent. There were no protracted screams. There was no grand theatrical dialogue of begging. The primal terror of facing a fully feral Lycan king stripped the air directly from the conspirator's lungs. The molten gold of the sovereign's eyes was the absolute last thing Lady Patricia and Lady Cynthia saw before the blistering, localized inferno of his wrath claimed the space. The stone floorboards groaned, cracking under the intense thermal shock, the rock itself glowing a faint, angry red beneath Garrick's heavy boots. The cloying, artificial stench of crushed roses and cheap musk was violently eradicated from the world, replaced entirely by the sterile, heavy scent of ozone and scorched earth. Garrick stood in the center of the ruined chamber, his chest heaving with slow, deliberate breaths. The feral beast beneath his skin roared for more violence, completely unappeased by the swiftness of the execution, demanding to tear the entire castle apart to ensure his mate's safety. But the memory of Evangeline's soft, fragile heartbeat echoing through the golden thread in his chest anchored him. He forced his elongated fangs to retract. He forced the lethal, razor-sharp claws extending from his fingertips to slowly recede back into his skin. He turned and walked back through the shattered remnants of the iron-banded doors. In the grand corridor outside, the captain of the guard and 24 light can warriors were kneeling on the frozen stone. They were hardened veterans of brutal border wars, yet they were trembling so violently their heavy iron armor rattled against the floor. None of them dared to look up. To meet the eyes of a Lycan king in the immediate aftermath of a mate-protecting frenzy was to invite instant death. "Send a detachment of the royal guard to the eastern territories," Garrick commanded. His voice was a low, guttural rasp that vibrated the ancient stones, devoid of all mercy. "You will deliver the ashes of this room to the Duke of Stirling in a lead box. You will inform him that the House of Stirling and the House of Thorn are officially stripped of all lands, titles, and breathing rights within my empire. They brought Wolfsbane into the den of their king. They targeted the Lunar of Valdris. If the Duke raises so much as a single objection, I will ride east and drown his entire bloodline in the frozen sea." The captain bowed his head so low his forehead touched the frigid floor. "It shall be done immediately, my king." Garrick did not wait to watch them scramble to obey. He turned away from the ruin and began the long, heavy walk back to the sanctuary. The descent from the adrenaline-fueled high of absolute violence was a physically agonizing process. As the king moved through the winding, torchlit corridors of his fortress, the massive muscles in his back and shoulders twitched and spasmed. The beast wanted to hunt, but the man desperately needed to protect. Before he reached the heavy iron gates of the inner wing, Garrick stopped in a small utilitarian washroom used by the castle guards. It was a stark, freezing room with a simple iron basin fed by a deep underground spring. The sovereign approached the basin, stripped off his blood-stained linen shirt, and plunged his hands into the icy water. The water hissed instantly, turning lukewarm upon contact with his feverish skin. He grabbed a block of harsh, unscented lye soap and scrubbed his hands and arms with brutal, punishing force. He scrubbed until his skin was raw and red. He needed to wash away the scent of ash. He needed to wash away the copper tang of violence. He could not bring the smell of death into the nesting room. He had to be a sanctuary, not an executioner. When he finally pushed open the heavy oak doors of his private quarters, the transition was staggering. The air inside the inner wing was perfectly still, profoundly warm, and saturated with the heavy, intoxicating aroma of sun-warmed lavender and summer rain. The sheer, overwhelming peace of the scent hit Garrick like a physical blow to the chest. The last lingering remnants of his feral rage instantly evaporated, leaving behind only the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had nearly lost his entire world. He walked silently into the bedchamber. Evangeline was asleep in the center of the massive fur-lined nesting bed. Her breathing was slow, even, and deep. The terrifying translucent pallor that had gripped her skin for the past 5 days had finally retreated, replaced by a radiant, healthy golden hue. Curled tightly against her side, his small fingers still gripping her white tunic, was Nicholas, the cursed prince, who had spent his entire 5 years of life locked in a state of perpetual, agonizing panic, was sleeping as peacefully as a mundane child. Garrick sank into the heavy armchair near the roaring hearth. He did not sleep. He simply watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, allowing the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, transmitted directly through the blazing golden thread of their mate bond, to slowly heal the fractured pieces of his soul. The absolute awakening came 2 mornings later. The fierce, blinding winter blizzards that had battered the winter castle for weeks finally broke. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting brilliant, pale yellow shafts of light through the thick frosted glass of the palace, battering the ancient stone walls with relentless sheets of ice and snow. Evie slowly opened her eyes. The heavy, suffocating lethargy that had weighed down her limbs since the poisoning was entirely gone. She took a deep breath, testing her lungs. There was no burning. There was no phantom constriction in her trachea. The lethal aconite extract had been completely eradicated from her cellular structure. She pushed herself up against the mountain of plush-down pillows, her storm-glass grey eyes wide with a quiet, profound sense of awe. She felt strong. Stronger, in fact, than she had ever felt in her entire life. The ancient, dormant lunar magic within her blood had not just survived the poison, it had awakened fully, merging with the dominant, fiercely protective alpha vitality Garrick had poured into her veins. "Ah, you are sitting up." Dr. Julian Mercer stepped quietly into the room, holding a small wooden tray. The royal physician looked significantly older than he had a month ago. The stress of the near tragedy, carving deep lines around his eyes, but his smile was genuine and profoundly relieved. Behind him, Mrs. Croft followed closely, carrying a steaming bowl of rich bone broth seasoned with wild sage. Evie instinctively reached for the collar of her tunic, her fingers brushing the side of her neck. "It is a scar, Evangeline," Dr. Mercer said softly, setting his medical bag on the heavy oak table. A very faint silver line where the black veins originally surfaced. "It will not fade, but it will not harm you. It is a mark of survival." Mrs. Croft approached the edge of the nesting bed, her stern face softening as she offered the warm bowl. "You must eat, my lady. The king has practically threatened to tear down the castle stones with his bare hands if you do not regain your full strength by the end of the week." Evie took the wooden bowl, the heat radiating beautifully through her palms. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice clear, the gravelly rawness completely healed. "And Nico? The king is in the courtyard, officially dismantling the private armies of the nobles who conspired against yous," Mrs. Croft answered, a fierce, unapologetic satisfaction colouring her tone. "And the young prince is waiting just outside the door. He refused to leave the corridor until he knew you were awake." "Let him in," Evie said immediately, setting the broth aside. "Please." Mrs. Croft nodded and opened the heavy door. Little Nicholas stumbled into the room. He was wearing a soft woolen sweater and his cloudy, storm-glass grey eyes were wide and searching. Clutched tightly against his chest were his carved wooden blocks. Because of his diminished sight, he navigated the massive chamber using the sounds of the crackling fire, the deep anchoring scent of lavender, and the tactile reality of the deep patterns carved into the wood he held to ground himself. He found the edge of the bed and practically scrambled up the furs, dropping the carved wooden blocks onto the plush blanket. Evie caught him effortlessly, wrapping her arms around his small frame and pulling him directly into her lap. Nico buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling a massive, shuddering breath. His tiny hands reached up, his fingers blindly, frantically mapping her face. He felt her cheeks, her jaw, and finally, his small fingertips brushed the raised silver scar on her neck. "It doesn't hurt, sweet boy," Evie murmured, pressing a soft kiss to his dark curls. "The poison is gone." "I heard the glass break," Nico whispered, his voice trembling with the residual terror of a child who had nearly lost his sanctuary. "You fell down. The room got so cold again. I thought the black ice was coming back to take you away." Evie's heart tightened painfully. She wrapped him closer, enveloping him entirely in the warm, radiant glow of her lunar magic. She reached for one of the carved wooden blocks and placed it gently in his hand, letting him trace the deep grooves to ease his panic. "The black ice is never coming back, Nico. The curse is broken. You are safe. I am safe." The boy pulled back just slightly, his blind eyes turning up toward her face. His small hands gripped the carved wooden blocks with desperate, white-knuckled force. "The other ladies," he said, his lower lip quivering. The ones in the ballroom. When the cold came, they ran away. They screamed at me. They said I was a monster. You are not a monster, Evie said fiercely, her voice vibrating with a sudden, powerful surge of maternal authority that she didn't know she possessed. You are a wolf of Valdris. You are strong, and you are brave, and you are perfect exactly as you are. But I can't see the mountains, he cried quietly, a single tear slipping from his cloudy eye. I can't see the sky like Father does. Then I will describe every single stone, every single tree, and every single star to you until you know them by heart, Evie promised, resting her forehead against his. You will never have to walk in the dark alone. I will be your eyes whenever you need them. Nico let out a long, ragged sigh, his small body going entirely boneless against her chest. He rested his head over her heart, listening to the strong, steady rhythm pulsing beneath her ribs. Will you make my midnight orchid tea tonight? He asked, his voice muffled by the thick wool. Will you stay? I will always stay. The 5-year-old prince closed his eyes, a profound, unbreakable peace finally settling over his fractured spirit. Okay, he whispered. Okay, mother. The word dropped into the quiet stillness of the bedchamber with the staggering weight of a falling star. Mother. For her entire life, Evangeline had been an orphan, a servant, a ghost moving invisibly through the freezing corridors of a world that despised her. She had scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled. She had masked her lunar nature just to survive another day. And now, holding the cursed heir of the greatest kingdom in the north, she had been granted the most sacred, powerful title in existence. A tear slipped free, hot and heavy, trailing down her cheek to soak into Nico's dark hair. In the doorway, King Garrick stood completely frozen. The massive lichen warrior had returned from the courtyard, his boots covered in snow, to hear the final exchange. He leaned heavily against the stone doorframe, his golden eyes wide, completely disarmed. He brought a large, battle-scarred hand up to cover his mouth, choking back a rough, broken sound. A single tear tracked its way down his hardened, stubble-covered jaw. His son, his broken, terrified son, had finally found the light. Evie looked up, her grey eyes locking onto Garrick's golden ones across the room. The golden thread connecting their souls flared with a brilliance that rivaled the morning sun. There was no need for words. The king crossed the room in 3 long strides, climbing onto the edge of the massive nesting bed, and wrapped his enormous arms around both of them, burying his face in Evie's shoulder. They sat there in the silence of the sanctuary, 3 broken pieces of a puzzle finally snapping together to form an impenetrable whole. 1 month later, the Valerian stronghold was utterly transformed. The grand ballroom, which had once been a freezing, hostile arena of toxic political ambition and cruel judgment, was now a masterpiece of warmth and light. The thick ice that used to cling to the high vaulted ceilings had melted entirely, replaced by hanging tapestries of rich crimson and silver. The crackling blue flames of the massive stone hearths had been extinguished, making way for roaring natural fires that bathed the room in a rich golden glow. The oppressive, metallic scents of fear and crushed roses were gone, washed away by the deep, grounding aromas of pine needles, cedar wood, and sweet lavender. Thousands of lichens filled the cavernous hall. Elite warriors, regional alphas, and the surviving nobility stood shoulder to shoulder. But the atmosphere was not one of arrogant competition. The invisible language of the pack, their scent, their posture, their breathing, spoke volumes. Fear smelled like soured copper. Blind ambition smelled like rotting meat hidden beneath perfumes. Today, the cavernous hall carried none of that poison. It smelled only of absolute, terrified reverence. The sheer physical weight of the king's presence, intertwined perfectly with the awakening lunar magic of his chosen mate, pressed down on every single soul. The massive oak doors at the top of the grand staircase groaned open. Evangeline Vance did not walk a step behind the king. She walked beside him. She was no longer wearing the scratchy, humiliating grey wool uniform of a servant. She was draped in a breathtaking gown of midnight blue silk, lined with heavy silver fox furs that brushed against the polished marble steps. Her long hair, no longer tied back in a severe, invisible bun, flowed freely over her shoulders like spun moonlight. At her throat, the delicate silver scar gleamed proudly in the torchlight, physical proof of the venom she had conquered. As she descended the stairs, her hand resting securely in Garrick's massive warm palm, the entire ballroom moved as one. It was a physical wave of submission that started at the front of the hall and rolled violently to the back. Grown men, legendary warriors who had fought in the bloodiest border skirmishes, and high-born ladies who had once sneered at her poverty, dropped to their knees. The sound was deafening. A synchronized, thunderous crash of armor and bone hitting the polished marble floor. They bowed their heads, exposing the vulnerable backs of their necks in total, unquestioning surrender to their Luna. The sheer gravity of her presence, radiating the soothing warmth of midnight orchids and summer rain, completely dismantled their predatory instincts. Evie looked out over the sea of bowed heads. She held herself with quiet poise, chin tucked and shoulders squared. In her youth, she had used that exact posture to make herself small, to hide from the cruelty of the high houses, to survive the brutal indignities of her station. Today, she kept her spine straight not out of fear, but to carry the immense, beautiful weight of a kingdom that finally belonged to her. Garrick led her to the center of the dais, directly in front of the roaring hearth. Standing there, waiting with a bright, fearless smile, was Nicholas. The young prince was dressed in a pristine white tunic, a small silver circlet resting in his dark curls. He reached out his hands, and Evie took them immediately, giving his small fingers a reassuring squeeze. King Garrick turned to face his empire. He did not raise his voice to a shout, but the deep, resonant baritone of his alpha command carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the hall. "You came to this castle looking for a crown," Garrick declared, his golden eyes sweeping over the kneeling nobility. "You believed that power was measured by bloodlines, by the size of your armies, and by the cruelty you were willing to inflict upon those you deemed weak. For centuries, the Seventh Eclipse era has been ruled by the freezing grip of a merciless winter. You were taught that to survive, you had to abandon the vulnerable. You looked at my son, the disabled heir to the greatest empire in the north, and you recoiled. You left him to freeze in his own terror. You proved your cowardiops disguised as tradition." He paused, the heavy silence of the room vibrating with his suppressed fury. When he spoke again, the violence in his tone had shifted into absolute conviction. "You were wrong," Garrick growled, his voice a guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "The old laws of cruelty die tonight. The winter of our arrogance is over." He turned to Evangeline, his expression softening into a look of such profound, devastating devotion that it made the very air in the room shimmer with heat. He reached into the heavy leather pouch at his belt and withdrew the silver crest of Valdris. It was no longer a heavy signet ring meant for a warrior's fist. He had personally carried it to the royal forge, melting down the ancient metal and reshaping it into a delicate, beautifully intricate crown of woven silver wolves and crescent moons. "Absolute power," the king continued, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate whisper meant only for her, though the entire hall heard it, is the courage to walk into the freezing dark to save a child that is not your own. Absolute power is the strength to nurture when the world demands you destroy. It is drinking the venom meant to end your family, and surviving to become the radiant light of my soul. Garrick Valerius, the most terrifying monarch in the Northern Territories, went down on one knee before the entire pack. He raised the silver crown and gently, reverently placed it upon Evangeline's head. "I claim you, Evangeline, not just as my mate, not just as my Luna, but as the very heart of Valdris." The moment the silver touched her brow, the mate bond exploded outward. It was not an invisible connection this time. A literal, physical wave of radiant, sun-warmed magic rolled through the ballroom, washing over every single lichen present. The air smelled of heavy summer rain and blooming orchids. It was a sensation of absolute safety, a promise from the moon goddess herself that the era of freezing cruelty was over. The pack threw their heads back. The howl that erupted from 1,000 throats was deafening, a primal, earth-shaking vibration of pure joy and absolute loyalty that rattled the frosted windows and echoed out into the dark, snowy mountains. Evie looked down at the king kneeling before her, and then at the sun gripping her hand so tightly. The hollow, empty ache that had defined her entire existence had been filled to overflowing. The venom had failed, the arrogance of the nobles had burned to ash, and the quiet, invisible maid who had once dropped her silver tray to save a crying boy was finally, undeniably, home. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. Thank you for listening to this story. Fated mates are not chosen by bloodlines, but by the courage to choose each other, even when the world is entirely frozen. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments below. Did the Lycan King deliver the exact kind of justice those traitors deserved? Your thoughts mean more to me than you know, and if you want to hear more stories of quiet endurance rewarded with absolute, unyielding devotion, make sure to subscribe and join our sanctuary. Until next time, stay safe in the dark.